January 6, 1944. The cold wind swept across the quiet fields of southern England, rattling the windows of the 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe. Inside, Major General Jimmy Doolittle stood in the office of General William Kepner, staring at a small wooden sign hanging behind his desk. It read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." For months, those words had defined the mission of American fighter pilots: escort the bombers, stay close and protect them at all costs. But Doolittle, a battle-hardened pilot and engineer who had once led the daring Tokyo raid, knew something was wrong. He turned to Kepner and said quietly, "That sign needs to come down." Within hours, a new sign was hung in its place. "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." It was a simple change in language, but in reality, it marked one of the most dramatic shifts in air warfare in history. For over a year, the skies over Europe had been a nightmare for the Allied bomber crews. Missions deep into Germany meant facing waves of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that tore through the B-17 formations like wolves among sheep. On October 14, 1943, the second raid on Schweinfurt cost the U.S. nearly 600 men and 60 bombers in a single day. Lieutenant Robert Morgan of the Memphis Belle wrote in his diary that night, "We are being slaughtered. The fighters turn back at the German border, and we fly on alone into hell. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings escorting. The bombers simply didn't have the range to reach the heart of Germany. Beyond the border, the bombers were on their own, easy prey for the Luftwaffe's deadly hunters." The situation became so desperate that General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, issued an ultimatum to his subordinates. Unless the German Air Force is destroyed, the invasion of France cannot proceed. D-Day itself depended on winning the air. Then in late 1943, salvation appeared: the North American P-51 Mustang, a sleek, silver machine powered by the British-designed Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Fast, agile, and with extraordinary range, the Mustang could finally escort bombers to any target in Germany and back again. But having the plane was not enough. The question was, how should it be used? For years, U.S. fighter pilots were ordered to fly close to the bombers, forming a protective cage, never straying too far away. It was a defensive mindset that made them predictable targets. The Luftwaffe could choose when and where to strike, knowing the escorts would never leave formation. Doolittle, however, was not a man who believed in playing defense. He understood that air superiority wasn't achieved by shielding, it was achieved by striking first. So on his very first day in command, he issued a radical new order. Fighters are no longer to fly defensively. They are to seek out the enemy and destroy him. No more tight formations, no more reactive flying. American fighters would now range far ahead of the bombers, sweeping the skies clean of German interceptors before they could even reach the bombers. When the bombers turned home, the Mustangs would dive to low altitude, strafing airfields, fuel depots, and trains, destroying the Luftwaffe wherever it lived. Many bomber crews were horrified, believing this meant abandonment. But Doolittle knew what he was doing. The best way to protect the bombers was to eliminate the enemy before he ever got close. The new doctrine was tested on January 29, 1944, when 800 bombers headed toward Frankfurt, escorted by the Mustangs of the 357th Fighter Group. Near Bonn, the P-51 spotted 50 Messerschmitts climbing to intercept. The Germans never saw them coming. Diving from the sun, the Mustangs ripped through their formation in minutes. 13 enemy fighters destroyed, none escaped. The bombers made it home without a single loss. It was the first time the hunters had become the hunted. 3 weeks later came Big Week, a massive series of raids on Germany's aircraft factories, meant to draw every Luftwaffe fighter into the air. Over 1,000 bombers roared across Europe, with hundreds of P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s sweeping ahead. The sky became a storm of fire, smoke, and contrails. German Ace Major Heinz Baer wrote in despair, "They attack us before we can climb. When we land, when we take off, there is no escape." The Luftwaffe lost 350 planes and, worse, nearly 100 veteran pilots, men who could never be replaced. The Americans suffered losses too, but they could replace both men and machines. The Germans could not. As spring came, the balance of power shifted. In March, when U.S. bombers struck Berlin, The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the fight. The result was catastrophic. The Americans lost 69 bombers. The Germans lost twice as many fighters and nearly 70 of their most experienced aces. One German officer wrote in his diary, "Today, I watched the fighter arm die." By April, the once feared Luftwaffe was collapsing. Its airfields were under daily attack, its fuel supplies gone, and its new recruits had barely 150 hours of training compared to the Americans. 450. The skies belonged to Doolittle's men now. On May 8, 1944, 900 bombers crossed into Germany, escorted by 750 fighters. Not a single German plane rose to meet them. The Luftwaffe still had aircraft, but no pilots, no fuel, and no hope. By the time Allied troops landed on Normandy's beaches a month later, total air supremacy had been achieved. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel wrote to his wife, "The enemy has complete control of the air. Our troops cannot move in daylight without being attacked. The war is lost." In just 6 months, Doolittle's bold doctrine had destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. Between January and June 1944, Germany lost over 2,500 fighter pilots, 3/4 of its strength. Those who replaced them barely knew how to fly. Meanwhile, American kill
ratios soared above 4-1. The
once invincible German air arm was reduced to ashes. Even advanced aircraft like the jet-powered Me-262 arrived too late. The men who could have flown them were already dead. When asked years later if he ever doubted his decision, Doolittle said, "Changing the fighter tactics was the hardest thing I ever did. People thought it was madness. But you can't win a war by defending. You win by attacking." Today, in the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, both signs hang side by side. The old one that urged protection, and the new one that demanded destruction. Together, they tell the story of how one man's courage to change. The rules of war turned the tide of the air. Battle over Europe. It began with just a few words on a wall, but those words gave the Allies the skies, and ultimately victory itself.